The storm rolled in with the hunger of a beast, black clouds devouring the pale mountain sky, and to the land below was cloaked in shadow. Wind hissed through the pines, rattling their frozen needles like bones strung on a wire, and the smell of snow pressed down on the valley. Elias Boone stood outside his cabin. Broad shoulders braced against the gale, a rifle slung across his arm, and the silence within him as heavy as the mountains themselves. They said a man could carve his fate in the wilderness, but Elias had long since stopped believing in fate. What he believed in was survival, and survival came with scars. The lines etched into his face weren't the marks of age alone. Years ago, he had been a husband, a father, a man who laughed as freely as he swung an axe into wood. That was before the raid, before smoke swallowed his cabin, before gunfire ripped apart his family's laughter. His wife's scream still woke him on nights when the fire in his hearth died low. His son's small hand, once warm in his own, lingered in memory like a phantom. He had escaped with his life, but life itself had turned into a sentence. Since then, Elias had built his existence around solitude. He hunted, he trapped, he patched his cabin with his own 2 hands, and he kept company with ghosts. But ghosts don't cook meals, and hunger gnawed even at men too proud to admit they couldn't do everything alone. Word had reached him of a woman newly widowed, carrying a child inside her and desperate enough to take work few others would offer. Elias had ridden into town once that winter, exchanged the barest of word with her, and laid down coin on the table of the saloon to seal a bargain. She would cook for him, keep the hearth burning, and in return she would have a roof and food until her child was born. He told himself it was simple. A trade, nothing more. Now, as he stood by his cabin door waiting for her arrival, a disquiet pressed at his chest. The woman's name was Clara May. He had spoken it only once, tasting its softness like an unfamiliar spice on his tongue. He didn't want her name filling his home. He wanted her labor, her quiet, and no more. Yet, when the crunch of hooves came through the snow, his chest tightened against his own command. Clara rode up on a borrowed mule, a threadbare shawl tied over her shoulders, her belly already rounded beneath her coat. Snow clung to the hem of her skirt, her boots half swallowed by drifts. She looked like someone who had walked straight out of hardship and into his life with nothing but stubbornness to keep her upright. When she slid from the saddle, her eyes met his without flinching. They were not the eyes of someone broken. "You're Elias Boone?" she asked, her voice low but steady. He gave a single nod. Words didn't come easy to him anymore. "Well," she said, brushing snow from her coat, "if you got a fire, I'll set a pot on it. Can't promise much more until I've seen your stores. I reckon you men think beans grow themselves in sacks." The corner of her mouth twitched as though daring him to be offended. Elias blinked, uncertain whether to bristle or smirk, and found himself doing neither. He gestured toward the cabin. "Inside," he muttered. The cabin was spare but solid, the kind of home shaped by hands that expected no one else to live in it. A rough-hewn table, a single chair, a rifle mounted above the door, pelts nailed along the wall for warmth. Clara stepped across the threshold and took it in with one sweeping glance. He waited for her to complain. She didn't. She merely set down her bundle, pulled the shawl from her shoulders, and made her way toward the hearth as though she belonged there already. Elias watched her movements with the wary interest of a man who had spent too long in silence. She stirred life into the fire, set a pot to warm, and began rummaging through the meager stores of flour and beans he had gathered. Her hands were quick, competent, unhesitating. She asked no permission, and he gave none. It unsettled him, this quiet authority in his home, but he found himself unable to stop it. Night came heavy, and the wind outside rose like a choir of wolves. Within the cabin, warm spread, carrying with it the scent of beans simmering. Elias sat at the table, his eyes fixed on the flicker of the flames, listening to the crackle of wood and the small sounds of Clara moving about. He wanted to keep the silence between them, but she broke it with a dry laugh. "You look like a man who ain't had a decent meal in months." He grunted, not lifting his eyes. "Well," she said, ladling stew into a bowl, "you'll have one tonight. I'm not your servant, mind you, but I'll see to it you don't starve, if only for the sake of this child." She laid a hand on her belly, protective and fierce. Something shifted in Elias then. Not pity, he despised pity, but a recognition. She wasn't cooking for him. She was cooking to survive, for herself and the life within her. He respected that. He had built his world on survival too. Only his survival had left him hollow. Hers carried promise. They ate in silence, save for the storm outside. When she finally rose to clear the bowls, Elias found his gaze lingering too long on the determination in her posture, the way she carried both weariness and defiance as though they were weights she had chosen to bear. Later, when he stepped outside to check the traps near the tree line, the night pressed in thick and cold. From the dark came the distant howl of wolves, sharp and rising. He gripped his rifle tighter, the old ache of memory tugging at him. Wolves, bandits, storms. It never mattered what shape danger took. It always came. He turned back to the cabin, the glow of fire seeping from its cracks like a fragile beacon. Inside, a woman he barely knew stirred life into the emptiness he had called home. He had thought he was buying a cook, what he had truly invited into his world, though he did not yet understand, was the beginning of a reckoning. Elias woke before dawn, as he always did, the habit carved into his bones from years of living where daylight meant survival. He expected to find Clara asleep on the cot he'd cleared for her near the hearth, but instead the fire was already crackling and the faint aroma of bread filled the cabin. She was at the table, sleeves rolled, dusting flour across the surface like she'd been doing it all her life. For a moment, Elias only watched, unsettled by how her presence shifted the space. His cabin had always felt like a tomb, but now it breathed differently, alive with the rhythm of her movements. She didn't look up when she spoke. "Coffee's on the boil. Best sit before it goes bitter." Elias grunted, half out of resistance, half out of surprise. It wasn't often another voice greeted him in the morning, and certainly not with the easy certainty she carried. He sat, more out of curiosity than obedience, and Clara slid a mug across to him without ceremony. He took it, the bitter liquid scalding his tongue, and felt his jaw tighten. Not at the taste, but at the way she made herself at home so swiftly. The days that followed carved a new pattern. Clara cooked, cleaned, and spoke her mind with candor that tugged at the silence Elias had wrapped around himself like armor. He wanted to believe she was temporary, a shadow passing through, but her voice, her humor, even her irritation with his stubbornness pressed into grain of his days. She had a way of looking at him that was neither fearful nor reverent, a way that made him feel uncomfortably seen. When he tried to enforce rules, no touching his tools, no asking questions about his business, she listened, nodded, then broke them without hesitation. Once, when he returned from checking traps, he found her sharpening his hunting knife on the whetstone. His first instinct was to bark at her, but the way she tested the blade with a thumb, utterly unafraid, halted the words on his tongue. "You cut yourself," he muttered. She gave him a glance sharp as the edge she'd honed. "I was cooking for a ranch full of cowhands before you were brooding up here in the mountains. I know my way around a blade." He should have been angry. Instead, a reluctant smirk tugged at his mouth before he caught it. Clara noticed. She always noticed. One evening, she caught a chill, the thinness of her coat no match for the mountain cold. Elias attempted to cook in her stead, insisting she stay wrapped in blankets near the fire. The result was a scorched pan of beans so bitter they were nearly inedible. Clara, pale with fever, still managed to laugh until tears pricked her eyes. "Lord above, you'd starve yourself if I weren't here," she teased between coughs. Elias scowled, but a flicker of warmth stirred in him, a memory of laughter echoing in his home again. Faint but real. The snow deepened as the weeks passed, muffling the valley in silence. Yet beyond that silence, danger brewed. Tracks appeared near the tree line, not the padded marks of wolves, but boot prints. Elias studied them with a tightening gut. Bandits roamed these parts when winter pressed too hard against their bellies, and desperate men were always the most reckless. He returned to the cabin with jaw set, rifle slung, and Clara waiting by the fire. She saw the tension in his face before he spoke. "What is it?" "Trouble," he said simply, hanging his coat. "Men moving through the valley. Don't know how many." Her hand instinctively rested on her belly, and her eyes hardened rather than wavered. "Then we'll be ready." The word we struck him harder than he expected. He had never thought of her as part of his fight, but the way she said it, steady and unyielding, rooted itself in him. That night, as wind rattled the shutters, Clara refused to sleep. She cleaned the pistol Elias had left untouched on a shelf since his family's death. He had avoided it, as though the weight of the weapon carried too many memories. Now she handled it with calm precision, her fingers moving with practiced care. "You've used one before," Elias said, his tone more observation than question. "My husband wasn't much good at protecting anything but his pride," she answered softly. "So I learned." Elias had no reply. He only watched her, something unspoken stirring in him again, a recognition of strength carved from suffering. The days grew sharper, and the unease in Elias's chest thickened with every echo that carried across the valley. One evening, while the fire painted the cabin walls in amber, Clara asked him a question that lodged itself like a burr under his skin. "Why do you live out here alone, Elias?" He stiffened, staring into the flames. Silence stretched, heavy and brittle. She didn't press, only waited. At last his voice came low, scraped from a place he seldom dared touch. "Because everything I cared for burned, and what was left of me didn't belong anywhere else." Clara's eyes softened, but there was no pity in them, only understanding. "Then maybe what's left of you is waiting to be something more." Her words lingered long after she turned to rest. He sat awake, staring into the dark, wrestling with the unwelcome seed she had planted. A few nights later, the valley erupted with the sound he had been dreading. Gunshots cracked in the distance, echoing off the ridges like thunder. Elias's blood ran cold, his body moving before his thoughts caught up. He snatched his rifle, checked the chamber, and scanned the black forest beyond the cabin. Clara appeared at his side, pale but resolute, her hand steady on the pistol. She didn't flinch at the sound of danger, didn't hide behind him. Instead, she stood ready, her breath visible in sharp bursts of fear and determination. Elias's pulse pounded, memories slamming back. The firelight of raiders, his family screams, his own helplessness. Only this time, he wasn't alone. This time, there was someone inside that cabin who mattered, someone he could not lose. The wolves howled in answer to the gunfire, a chilling chorus that threaded through the night. Elias clenched his jaw, his gaze cutting through the darkness, heart torn between the past that haunted him and the present that demanded his strength. For the first time in years, Elias Boone felt the weight of responsibility not for his own survival, but for another life. And though he didn't yet realize it, that weight was already reshaping him. staggered, fell, and was swallowed by the snow. Clara flinched at the sound, but didn't falter. When another shadow broke from the tree line, she raised her pistol and fired. The shot rang true. The man stumbled, cried out, and vanished into the drifts. Elias turned toward her in disbelief, but Clara's face was pale steel. "Told you," she murmured, reloading with shaking fingers. The cabin filled with smoke and noise, the air thick with powder, and the acrid stench of burning where bullets had sparked against the walls. Elias moved like a man possessed, his rifle bucking against his shoulder, his body reliving a nightmare, yet refusing to surrender to it again. He heard shouts, curses, the crunch of boots retreating, then returning with fury. One bandit lunged through the half-shattered door, knife flashing in the firelight. Elias swung the butt of his rifle into the man's skull with a sickening crack. The bandit collapsed at his feet, groaning, then stilled. Elias's chest heaved, sweat stinging his eyes though the cabin was freezing. He barely had time to breathe before Clara shouted, "Left side!" Another figure darted past a window, rifle raised. Clara's second shot went wide, grazing the frame, but it gave Elias the moment he needed. His bullet dropped the man into the snow, silence rushing in to swallow his cry. Then stillness, only the storm wind, the faint moan of the injured outside, and the ragged pant of their own breath. Elias kept his rifle trained on the window, waiting, every nerve strung tight as a wire. Minutes passed like hours before the sound of retreating boots echoed across the valley. The survivors were fleeing. For now, he lowered the rifle slowly, muscles trembling from the strain. Clara leaned against the wall, pistol still clutched, her breath shallow. Her eyes met his, and for a moment the battle noise faded into something deeper, a silence carved of exhaustion, fear, and unspoken gratitude. Elias crossed the room, crouched before her. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. Clara shook her head, lips pressing thin. "No, we saved each other." The words struck deeper than the bullets that had torn into his walls. Elias had spent years convincing himself that connection was weakness, that letting anyone close would only invite ruin. Yet here she stood, fierce and unyielding, refusing to let him fight alone. A sharp cry cut through the quiet. At first Elias thought it was a wind, but then Clara doubled over, her hand clutching her belly, her face twisted with pain, a sound torn from her throat that chilled him more than any gunfire. "Clara?" His voice broke with sudden panic. Her breath came ragged, her eyes wide with both fear and certainty. "It's time," she gasped. Elias froze, his mind blank. He could face a dozen armed men without flinching. But this he did not know how to fight. The room spun with the weight of it, the fire crackling too loud, the shadows pressing too close. Clara grabbed his hand, squeezed hard enough to drag him back from the edge of fear. "Don't just stand there," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Help me?" Elias swallowed hard, forcing air into his lungs. He had fought wolves, storms, and raiders, but this was a different kind of battle, one he could not win with bullets or rage. He looked into her eyes, saw the raw strength blazing to the pain, and felt something within him shift. The bandits were gone, but a greater storm had arrived, and Elias Boone knew he had no choice but to face it, not with violence, but with a courage he had never learned until now. The storm raged outside as if the heavens themselves had decided to test the strength of the cabin walls. Snow lashed the shutters, the wind shrieked through the chimney, and inside, Clara's cries rose and fell like a hymn of agony. Elias moved as if in a fevered dream, every instinct screaming that he was unprepared, unworthy, incapable of what was demanded of him. He had fought men with knives at his throat and guns at his back, but this was a battle of life against death that had no rules he understood. Clara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, sweat beading along her brow despite the cold. "Stay with me," she gasped, her voice torn between pain and command. "Don't you dare falter now." Elias knelt beside her, clumsy hands trying to steady her shoulders, his heart a thunder in his chest. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, the words scraping out of him like confession. Her eyes locked on his, fierce and unyielding. "Then learn fast. This child isn't waiting on your doubts." The force of her will struck him like a hammer. He had thought her strong before, but now, in the firelight, bent under the weight of labor yet refusing to surrender, she was something greater, unyielding, elemental, a storm within a storm. He boiled water because she told him to. He tore cloth because she demanded it. Every order from her lips gave him purpose, pulled him out of his fear, forced his hands to act. The hours stretched like years, filled with her cries, his muttered reassurances, and the relentless howl of the blizzard outside. Once, when she sagged against him, her strength faltering, panic surged in him so strong it nearly broke him. But then she whispered his name, just his name, with a trust that burned through his despair. He clenched his jaw and swore he would not let her down. The moment came sudden and raw. A final cry, long and desperate, split the cabin air, and then it was answered by another cry, thin and fierce, the sound of new life cutting through the storm. Elias stared down at the tiny, writhing body in his hands, his breath stolen. The child's lungs filled the room with protest, demanding the world acknowledge her arrival. Clara collapsed back, tears streaking her cheeks, her chest heaving as she reached weakly for the baby. Elias laid the child in her arms, and in that instant the cabin was transformed. The firelight seemed warmer, the shadows gentler, the very air charged with something sacred. Clara pressed her lips to the infant's forehead, her eyes closing as though in prayer. "She's here," she whispered, voice breaking with awe. "She's here, Elias." He could not speak. His throat was thick, his eyes burning with tears he had thought long buried. The weight of the child's cry, the sight of Clara cradling life where moments ago there had been only struggle, tore through every wall he had built. He sank to his knees beside them, his rough hand trembling as it brushed the infant's tiny fist. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his, impossibly small, impossibly strong. Elias Boone had thought himself broken beyond repair, a man whose heart had been reduced to ash. But now, staring into a fragile miracle of life, he felt something stir deep within, a crack in the stone, a breath of warmth, the faint but undeniable pulse of hope. Clara opened her eyes, exhaustion etched into her face, but triumph blazing through it. "You didn't just deliver her," she murmured, her gaze piercing him. "You delivered yourself." The words struck true. He had survived loss by shutting out the world, but survival was not living. Living was this, risking, fighting, and holding on to what mattered even when it hurt. Living was kneeling in the glow of a fire, watching a newborn breathe. Days passed, the storm easing, the valley blanketed in silence. The bandits had not returned. Perhaps the cabin's resistance had driven them elsewhere, or perhaps the storm had swallowed them whole. Elias did not care. His world had shrunk to the circle of firelight, the woman who moved through it with quiet strength, and the child who now filled it with sound. He built new routines, not out of habit, but out of devotion. He chopped wood with a vigor he had not felt in years, not just to keep the cold at bay, but to keep Clara and the child warm. He hunted, not for himself, but to see Clara smile faintly when broth touched her lips. At night, when the baby cried, he rose without complaint, pacing the floorboards of the small bundle nestled against his chest. The tiny heartbeat pressed against the skin was enough to banish even the darkest ghosts. One evening, when the valley lay hushed under the pale glow of moonlight, Elias stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting, but clear. The stars blazed across the sky, cold and eternal. Yet for the first time he did not feel dwarfed by their distance. Behind him, through the cabin window, he saw Clara rocking the child, her silhouette haloed by firelight. He felt a heaviness in his chest, not the weight of sorrow, but the fullness of something long denied, love, fragile and fierce. He whispered into the night, to the mountains, to the ghosts that had once haunted him. "I'll protect them, with all that I am." The vow was not born of guilt or fear, but of choice. For the first time in years, Elias Boone chose life. Inside, Clara looked up as he returned, her eyes meeting his with quiet understanding. No words were needed. The bond between them had been forged not in ease but in fire, and it would endure. Later, as the baby slept, Elias held her close, her tiny breasts warming his chest. He thought of the man he had been, the hollow shell he had allowed himself to become, and the man he was now, reshaped by love and responsibility. Greatness, he realized, had nothing to do with the battles he had fought or the scars he bore. Greatness was in the courage to begin again, in the strength to protect, in the grace to be changed by those who needed him. The fire crackled softly, the storm now only a memory. The mountains outside loomed vast and eternal, but inside the cabin a new story had begun. Elias Boone, once a man of silence and shadows, had found his voice again, not in words, but in the heartbeat of a child and the steady presence of a woman who had taught him how to live. And as the narrator's voice closed over the tale, it carried a reflection meant not just for Elias, but for anyone listening. Asterisk in the mountains, a man discovered that greatness is not carved with bullets or blood. It is forged in mercy, in love, and in the courage to live again. If this story stirred something within you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every story deserves an audience, just as every soul deserves redemption. Asterisk.